It's quiet in there. Your sweater, sitting on you, draped over your shoulders, folded in a drawer, hanging quietly in a closet, maybe draped over the back of a chair where you last left it, last you wore it. From the outside, it looks completely still. Just loops of fiber arranged into something warm. But inside those loops, things are happening. Particles are settling, moisture is moving, microscopic organisms are living entire lives in the spaces between the fibers. Because wool is one of the strangest and most fascinating materials that humans ever wear on our bodies. It regulates temperature, it breathes, it resists bacteria-based odors better than many to most synthetic materials, all of which can seem a little magical. But the reason wool can do those things is actually much simpler. Wool is constantly interacting with the world around it. And once you start paying attention to that interaction, it becomes very difficult to think about your knitwear in the same way again. If you were to take a wool sweater and remove a sample of the wool yarn and take a single wool fiber and look at it under a microscope, you discover something interesting. It isn't smooth. Instead, the surface of the fibers are covered with overlapping cuticles, like scales, like shingles on a roof, or, depending on the magnification, tiny cliffs and valleys, little ledges where particles can land, gather, and stay for a while. A wool fiber is not a smooth strand, it's terrain. And when you zoom out from one fiber to an entire sweater, you're looking at millions of those landscapes layered together. Lots of places where particles can settle, lots of places where things can linger. And there's another layer to the fiber that's worth mentioning. Wool naturally contains a waxy substance called lanolin. Lanolin. Lanolin is produced by the sheep's skin, and it coats the surface of the fibers of the entire fleece. Its job is simple. It protects the fleece of the sheep from the weather, rain, dirt, wind, the general chaos of living outside. Sheep do not have a delicate wash cycle setting. Lanolin repels liquid water, which subsequently helps wool shed light rain, but it also interacts readily with other oils, which means the wool fiber has this interesting dual personality. It can shed water, but it can bind with oily compounds and environmental molecules. Now, during the processing of wool into commercial yarn, most of that lanolin is removed. But the chemistry of the fiber, the part that interacts with moisture and oils, remains. And that chemistry plays a role in everything we're about to talk about. Wool is hygroscopic, which is a slightly fancy scientific way of saying it absorbs moisture vapor from the air. Not liquid water necessarily, vapor. Under the right conditions, wool can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in moisture before it ever begins to feel damp. That's one of the reasons wool is so comfortable across changing temperatures. The fiber is constantly balancing moisture between itself and the surrounding atmosphere, but moisture rarely travels alone. Air carries microscopic fragments of the environment with it. Dust, pollen, organic molecules, chemical traces from whatever happens to be happening around the room, which means when wool absorbs moisture from the air, it often absorbs traces of everything traveling through that air as well. Your sweater isn't just regulating temperature, it's quietly sampling the room. And the room, as it turns out, is very full. People shed skin constantly. Dermatology research suggests that we lose somewhere between 30 to 40,000 skin cells every minute, which is one of those facts that is scientifically interesting and maybe just a little unsettling. Now, most of those cells don't fall neatly to the floor. They become dust, and dust drifts through the air in our homes and eventually settles on surfaces, shelves, tables, floors, other small shelves filled with any number of Lego constructions that, if you choose not to remove each one, will never get access to those particles living beneath said Lego structures. Textiles, especially textured textiles, like wool, which means part of what settles into the fibers of a sweater is simply us, but not just us. Because if you, say, hug someone or brush past them in a crowded room, or briefly find yourself involved in a bar brawl wearing a woolen sweater, their skin cells travel too. Tiny fragments of other people quietly joining the ecosystem of your clothing, which is slightly a strange thought, but also a very human one. Forensic scientists who study trace evidence have known for a long time that microscopic materials move between people and objects far more easily than we tend to imagine. Fibers transfer, skin cells transfer, dust transfers. Simply sharing the same space can leave a faint trail of physical evidence behind. And textiles, with all their tiny surfaces and hidden spaces, are very good at holding on to them. And then there's life. Not your life and the life of the people around you, but microscopic life, microbial life. Every textile eventually becomes a surface where microscopic life can exist. Mostly a harmless bacteria from our own skin. The same microbes that arrive the moment we put on the sweater. Now, wool behaves a little differently than synthetic fabrics do in this case. Because of its chemistry and moisture behavior, wool tends to slow the bacterial growth that causes strong odors in our clothing, which is why wool sweaters can be worn multiple times without smelling the way plant-based fabrics or even other synthetic fabrics smell after only a few wears, or maybe even a single wear on a particularly warm day. But slowing bacterial growth is not the same thing as eliminating it. A worn sweater becomes a small ecosystem. Skin microbes, environmental microbes, dust mites passing through, quiet, microscopic life unfolding between the fibers. But here's where things get a little strange. Wool doesn't just collect particles. It can actually chemically interact with the air around it. Researchers studying indoor air quality have found that wool fibers can absorb certain air pollutants, things like formaldehyde, nitrogen oxides, other volatile compounds that exist in small amounts in the air around us. But some of these compounds don't just sit on the fiber. They react with the keratin that the wool is made from, which means that the fiber itself can be subtly altered by the air that it's been exposed to, chemically, on a molecular level. Your sweater doesn't just pass through environments. In small ways, it remembers them. Now, part of the reason wool interacts so readily with oils and pollutants is tied to the same chemistry that helps protect the sheep's fleece out in the pasture. The same chemistry we touched on earlier when we talked about lanolin. What evolved to help sheep survive outdoors turns out to interact quite readily with the modern environment. Scientists have experimented with wool fibers to help clean oil spills because wool can attract and trap oil remarkably well. In some conditions, wool can absorb many times its own weight in oil alone. All of this makes this strange little ecosystem inside of your sweater seem less like a flaw and more like a feature. Now, for those of you out there that are familiar, you may be wondering about superwash wool or washable wool, the kind that survives a trip through the washing machine. That treatment does change the surface of the fiber. Superwash processing smooths and coats those cuticle scales along the outside of the fiber, preventing them from locking together and felting under agitation. Now, I have an even deeper dive on the superwashing treatment coming out very soon, and we'll get into that more there, so keep posted next week. The superwash treatment means that the terrain we talked about earlier becomes much smoother, but the core structure of the fiber remains. It still interacts with moisture. It still exchanges molecules with the environment. It's simply a slightly more domesticated version of the fiber. And this brings us to one of the stranger myths surrounding wool that I hear about frequently in the comments or from folks that I speak to that are knitters or just wool enthusiasts in general. And in some way or another in my past, I have communicated myself prior to really understanding all the ins and outs and nuances of this particular myth, if you will. You may have heard it. It's that wool sweaters don't really need to be washed. And there is a grain of truth in that. Wool doesn't need frequent laundering the way that a lot of other synthetic fabrics usually do, but less often gradually becomes and evolves into something else entirely, which is the idea that some wool garments just should never be washed, which is, as it turns out, not exactly how the fiber was meant to live. Because remembering everything we just talked about, airborne particles, moisture exchange, skin cells, yours and other people's, environmental debris, microscopic life, a sweater collects. That's simply the nature of fiber. So what do we do with all of this information? What is the point for all of this? Well, the beautiful thing about wool is that it handles cleaning remarkably well. A gentle soak, cool water, a mild wool detergent, Woolite. You can get it at the grocery store. It's one of my favorites if you don't want to go crazy fancy. Not sponsored. Minimal agitation, laid flat to dry, and the landscape of the fiber refreshes itself. Not destroyed, just reset, which makes sense when you remember where wool comes from. Sheep live outdoors. A gentle wash every now and then is not a threat to wool. So the next time you put on a wool sweater, remember this. That garment has been interacting with the world every moment you've worn it, sampling the air, collecting fragments of the places you've been, quietly recording the atmosphere of your life. And every once in a while, it deserves a bath, because that sweater sitting quietly in your closet right now, it has lived. Wash your knits. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today. This was a fun one. It took me some time to put this one together. I've been working on it for a while, but I'm happy to finally be able to share it here with you guys today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care, wash your knits. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.